It's called a silent thief of productivity for a reason.
We're talking about Johne's disease, a disease that's highly contagious and fatal because there's no cure for it. Now, for most of us, we assume it's a disease in the dairy industry, but now we're starting to see it show up in the beef herd.
It's estimated today that about 8% of all beef herds in the U.S. have at least one infected animal.
Dr. Susan Hinckley is back as my guest as we discuss what causes Johne's disease, the 4 stages, what kind of testing is available, what can we do to manage against it, and why is it considered to be the silent thief of productivity. But a huge concern is that for the first 2 stages of Johne's, it's not visible, but they are contagious. So once an animal reaches visible stages, how many more cattle in your herd are infected?
What you see is only the very tip of the iceberg. So that makes Johne's disease something that can easily be ignored and then about 5-6 years later really bite you in terms of productivity.
If you're in the cattle business, buying, selling, or leasing bulls or cows, you might want to listen in to today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi, everyone. This is the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Episode 188 is what you are listening to, and we're glad to have you along for our program today. Talking Johne's disease, a topic that probably, it's not really something that pops up on everybody's radar to talk about, but I will tell you, if you're in the cattle business or the ranching business like we all are, it is something we need to be aware of and know about. So I think you're going to find today's show valuable from that standpoint. We'll get into that in just a few moments, but I did want to mention, as I said, this is episode 188, which means we've had a lot of other shows ahead of this, and a lot of these shows are extremely relevant no matter when you listen to them. So I just say that, so if you're just now catching up and finding Working Ranch Radio Show or the podcast version of it as well, go back and listen to some of the old shows. There have been a lot of relevant to no matter where you're at in the industry, and it comes from the perspective, I myself ranching in northeastern Wyoming, and a lot of the topics are things that either I might be dealing with or other folks similar in our industry also dealing with, and I think you'll find value in any of the previous shows. In the last couple of weeks, in fact, we've been kind of talking a little bit more on the nutritional subjects. Last week, we talked about added protein to your cow's diet. Is it worth it as we come out of this phase of getting these calves weaned off the cows and getting them rebuilt ready for the next phase in their life, which of course will be pre and post calving. And then of course they hit that cycle and start up again. We want them to breed back, all those kinds of things. So great conversation in last week's show. Now ahead of that one, we talked about the benefits of zinc supplementation prior to or after transportation. Some very fascinating information and research coming out of Iowa State University on that topic. And I think you'll find that very useful as well. Now ahead of that one, we talked about mRNA vaccines. That was in episode 185. Definitely a topic that has some controversy in the industry, but also probably some misconceptions as well. We tried to talk through that about what it really is, and I think you'll find that show valuable looking at that particular topic of mRNA vaccines. Well, be sure to tune in through our program here today and later on in the show. The Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor of Working Ranch Magazine, will be in for this week's edition of Tim's Two Cents. And of course, we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day with a look at that long-term weather. Well, as we jump to our subject here today, joining us on the program is Dr. Susan Hinckley with Neogen. She's the director of veterinary diagnostics. And Dr. Hinckley, glad to have you back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, last time you were on, we were talking about the blood pregnancy test with Neogen, and after we kind of wrapped up our conversation, you had mentioned just totally something completely different as far as has nothing to do necessarily with any product other than just being aware of something in our industry. And it's been around for a while, but it's Johne's disease. And I'd heard about it. I think for a lot of us as ranchers, we've probably heard about it, and it's definitely been something you're aware of, but probably as an industry whole, we don't know a whole lot about it. And so to get started with it today, I know it was discovered back in the early 1900s, and Johne's disease is chronic, very contagious, and it is fatal. Eventually, the animal will die because of it. So from that standpoint, let's start from the beginning and just explain a little bit about it and what it is.
Okay. So the fact that it was discovered in 1906 and is still around tells you that there's quite a few difficulties associated with it, and it has not been able to be eradicated. What it is an infection and disease caused by a bacterium, and the name of that bacterium is Mycobacterium avium, and then subspecies paratuberculosis. And if you hear the word tuberculosis, you're correct in that it's related to the bacterium that actually causes tuberculosis in cattle, which is Mycobacterium bovis. And what they have in common is that they are both very slow-growing organisms, both in a culture tube, but also in the organism. So once an animal gets infected, it takes a very long time for disease to develop. And logically then, during that time, it is very difficult to detect that you have a sick animal. It causes a chronic inflammation in the small intestine of cattle. And thereby, when it slowly grows and is progressive, it causes thickening of the gut with the outcome, the eventual outcome, that those cattle that are affected can no longer absorb any kind of nutrients. So they essentially starve to death. So the end stadium of the disease is complete emaciation, incurable diarrhea, and the animals are incredibly hungry and try to eat all the way up to their last day, but they can no longer utilize any of the nutrients of what they're eating.
So beyond the fact that it's fatal, which is serious enough, are there any other reasons why it's significantly important for us to be aware of for our industry?
So the significance of Johne's disease in cattle is driven by two things. Number one is that it's a welfare and a production issue, obviously. But the other one is that Mycobacterium paratuberculosis has been linked to human Crohn's disease.
Okay.
And is thereby carries a whole different urgency, right, of a zoonotic disease. And there's research that has shown that sometimes in milk, you can find live bacteria.
Okay.
So for the cattle world, what that means is it's shed. So the bacteria, once animals are infected, and the bacteria have grown to certain numbers in the body, it's shed. So bacteria are shed in the feces, which makes sense because they infect the gut. So the bacteria travel down the gut and then eventually gets shed in the feces. So when they shed, then you also have contamination of your environment. So actually, two things happen. You have contamination of your environment, and then if you have fecal contamination of teats of mama cows, then calves that suckle on those teats get automatically infected at a very, very early age in life, right? So the primary vehicle of transmission is actually mother's milk from contaminated teats. So there's currently, to be clear, right? There's currently not enough clear evidence to clearly link Mycobacterium paratuberculosis to human Crohn's disease. But the fact that it's been suggested repeatedly is enough reason to really be aware, both as a dairyman and also as a rancher, that you do not want it in your herds, because otherwise you're going to scare off all customers, right? So it's a very important on these two levels, animal welfare and the potential for zoonotic disease.
In regard to animal welfare, what are some other consequences that would affect us as ranchers and these cattle if there's something that has Johne's disease?
So it's not only an animal welfare issue, but it also is one of those silent production thieves. Because it's so slow growing, it's very difficult to detect early in life. And then so you have females with reduced fertility, less ability to make milk and raise calves in a cow-calf situation, premature culling, increase of clinical mastitis in dairy cows, and increased milk somatic cell counts. So you get penalized by wherever you sell your milk. For bulls, so if you're a bull raiser and you sell your bulls to service females, obviously, then the stress of actually servicing many females, like on a pasture, will bring Johne's disease out. And so the bull is simply unable to service all the cows. and then breaks out with diarrhea and spreads Johne's disease bacteria in his environment. So decreased milk production, shorter stability, premature culling. If you leave Johne's disease unchecked, then it will take the productivity of a farm down. So from that standpoint, it is important to be aware of what it is and then what to do if you have it.
Mm-hmm. In the past, I think there's been a lot of association that this was pretty much in the dairy industry more so, and it might be just because of the confinement compared to a range cow operation, but it's not necessarily the case anymore. We're starting to see a little more prevalence of it in the beef herd.
Yes, absolutely, that's true. So in dairy animals, that is correct. The prevalence is actually higher than in beef herds, but dairy herds are also better studied. So the control and such diagnostic measures have been studied more in dairy herds, but it's estimated today that about 8% of all beef herds in the U.S. have at least one infected animal. So, and because you don't really know right off the bat, there's no sneezing or coughing or immediate diarrhea that allows you to identify a sick animal. You cannot immediately isolate that animal or get rid of it. But when it starts shedding, that's when the cycle starts. It starts contaminating your environment, infects more animals, and then pretty soon you have a bunch of infected animals. Now, the interesting thing to note with Johne's disease, infection does not necessarily equal disease.
Okay.
So a lot of young animals very early in their life get infected, but it depends on the management, how fast and how well the disease progresses. The infection progresses into actual disease. So if you have an excellently managed herd with low stress levels and such, then you will not see as much disease as if you had, a super high producing dairy herd. So the better your management, the less of a problem it might be. But at the same time, it also can mask that you have infected animals on the premises that you don't know about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's kind of a two-edged sword.
Mm-hmm. So with the fact that this is a fairly slow-moving bacteria and the fact that, as you said, we don't really see any of the visible signs in these younger animals, does that lead us to, if we do have one animal in the herd that would have it, is there more that we don't know about?
So the iceberg phenomenon, that is because it's difficult to detect. It is estimated that for every clinical animal, so for every single animal that you find in your herd that is actually ill with Johne's disease and has diarrhea, there is several more animals in the subclinical stage that you don't know about, and then yet more animals in the silent stage that are infected but haven't progressed yet. So what you see is only the very tip of the iceberg. So that makes Johne's disease something that can easily be ignored and then about 5-6 years later really bite you in terms of productivity if you leave it unaddressed.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's take a break here, and when we come back, we still have a lot more to talk about in regards to Johne's disease. Dr. Hinckley's done a great job here so far of outlining what it is, some of the significant issues that it would bring to your herd, your ranching operation. When we come up next, we're going to be talking about the different stages. Later on, we'll be talking about testing as well as control management. A lot more to talk about when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. This segment today, though, brought to you by Barn Owl. It's what we use here on the X-Ring Ranch to watch stock tanks, our hay yard, cow camp corrals, fuel tanks. Real-time awareness starts with Barn Owl. It's about peace of mind. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Are you tired of putting the wear and tear on your ranch pickup or your good side-by-side out checking stock tanks or reservoirs? Or maybe it's just keeping an eye on a remote ranch location. When you stop and you think about it and you start to calculate the cost of your time, fuel, and miles on your vehicles, you're going to scare yourself. But there really is a very simple and a reassuring solution, and it's called Barn Owl. Barn Owl off-grid cameras and smart alerts provide you that assurance, and there's no question it is a time and a money saver. From anywhere at any time, no Wi-Fi or power needed. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl. Well, if you want to improve your herd's health and simplify your feeding routine, here's something you might consider. Smart Lick low moisture tubs. They're self-fed, weather-resistant, convenient. Smart Lick is packed with everything needed to balance a diet, support weight gain, and improve productivity. Smart Lick, it's not just another tub. It's the dependable way to get results. Find your dealer at smartlick.com. Again, the website is smartlic.com. Well, Dr. Susan Hinckley is back with us here again this week as we're talking Johne's disease, a very chronic, contagious, and fatal disease. As we talked about in the previous segment, the implications of that. Before we jump into what we were going to get into as far as the 4 different stages of Johne's disease, at the break, Dr. Hinckley, something that came up there as a question in regards to, is there certain areas of the country or climates more conducive to the prevalence of Johne's disease?
The only difference is the ability of the Johne's bacteria. Once it's shed in the environment, it survives a lot easier when it's cold and moist rather than dry and hot.
Okay.
So when shed in the environment, it's been shown with infection experiments that those bacteria can stay viable up to 8 months under the right conditions. So cold, moist, even freezing, but moist, and they don't nearly survive as well in very dusty, dry, hot environments in the south.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So let's now get into the 4 different stages of Johne's disease, because I think that's going to help to give us an understanding of what you talked about previously in regarding the iceberg phenomena, in the fact that what we see on the surface, or visibly what we see, there could be a bigger underlying problem that we're not seeing. So let's go through the 4 different stages of Johne's disease.
Yes. So the stages, there's essentially 4 different stages. The first one is called the silent stage. These animals are infected, so they harbor the bacteria. Bacteria have attached in the gut, but the presence of those bacteria is not detectable, and they show no signs of disease, and the immune response has not developed yet. So completely silent, essentially diagnostically non-detectable. Okay. So then the next stage, let's say, the bacteria progress in colonizing the gut and growing very slowly. So we're talking months, sometimes years here, right? Is called the subclinical stage. So subclinical, with clinical meaning visible, subclinical then means not visible. So these animals have progressed to the point where bacteria being shed. So there's enough bacteria that have accumulated that they are being moved through the gut and shed out in the feces, but you don't see any disease. There's no diarrhea, no off behavior, right? There might be, fertility might be reduced. So that's where you see the first production impacts. So shedding, but no disease. And at this stage, there may or there may not be an immune response. So, and that's important to know when we come to diagnostics. So there may or may not be in the subclinical stage. So after that stage, you go into the clinical stage. Okay. So enough bacteria that really compromise the function of the gut. Clinical means visible. Mm-hmm. So you see the first diarrhea. At that point, then you have pretty significant shedding of bacteria into the gut, and you do have an immune response. And then after that is going to be advanced disease, where you have extreme diarrhea, non-curable. So no matter what you do, that animal has terrible diarrhea. And the sad thing is they maintain their appetite all along, because what is impaired is the ability to absorb the nutrients. So they eat and eat and eat and actually are incredibly hungry, but they are unable to utilize any of the nutrients. And then they become extremely thin and die. So the consequence of advanced stage is always death.
Sure. So basically what you're saying from a ranch perspective is you see an animal that just has the ability to continue to eat and eat, and the body condition just continuing to get worse and worse.
Yes.
That's kind of something to be looking at, is what you're saying.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. That would be, if there's no other signs of disease, there's no fever, the animal's still walking around, but the diarrhea is definitely there, and it doesn't really subside. Mm-hmm. I mean, it might be a little better today and then back to where it was tomorrow, and the animal continues to eat.
Yeah.
yes, that is a tip-off for you to at least investigate.
So you went through these 4 stages that they go through. And of course, it would be that clinical stage from stage 3 and 4, clinical to advanced, when we could actually visibly see something. Is there anything ahead of that? Is there anything, tests or anything like that could be run to know, and is it economical to do to a herd?
Yeah, so the diagnosis of disease is very difficult. I mean, once you see something, and you see diarrhea, you collect a fecal sample, you take it to a diagnostic lab, and they can tell you whether or not there's bacteria in there by different methods. But what you're really interested in is how many animals in your herd are subclinical, and then from there you can estimate how many are silent. Right, so that's the iceberg phenomenon. For every single animal that you see, there is quite a few in the subclinical stage and then yet more in the silent stage. So the diagnostic tests that you can employ are twofold. One is the direct detection of the bacteria, and that's by culture. So some diagnostic labs are set up to actually culture your fecal material, or the cow's fecal material, and then in the end will tell you how many of the Johne's bacteria they found. The problem with that is the culture takes 12 weeks.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot
because
can
it's
happen.
yeah. Yes, a lot can happen. But that makes sense because it's a very, very slow-growing organism. So can take up to 12 weeks. The other method that is currently used, and that actually our diagnostic lab uses as well, is called PCR. And that is the polymerase chain reaction detecting the DNA of the bacteria. So you still send in a fecal sample, but it's being tested by this PCR. And then depending on how strong the PCR signal is, we can tell you how many or how strong the level of shedding is.
Okay.
So it can either be no, so the reaction is negative, no shedding. The reaction is positive, but not very strong, so that would be low shedding. Or the reaction is moderate, then you have moderate shedding, or high, and then you have a high shedding animal. And for a high shedder or a super shedder, just to put that in perspective, it is estimated that they shed up to 10 to the 6 bacteria per gram of feces. Per gram. So, right, if you take the whole pile of fecal matter that a cow deposits in one sitting, there's probably a pound or a pound and a half. That's 450 grams. So times 10 to the 6, and there you know how many bacteria you just deposited in your environment. So it's not insignificant. Let's put it that way. So the PCR is a lot faster. It does not have to wait for 12 weeks. It's usually like a week or so turnaround. And it's a single animal specific test. So it works well for the individual animal. So let's say you saw one, just like you had mentioned, that has diarrhea, but it's still eating and walking around such, and you tell yourself, oh, I wonder. So you go collect fecal matter from that animal and send it in, and we can tell you yes or no. The other test that can be done is a blood-based test that looks for the immune response. That test is called ELISA. It's a very nice acronym for detecting the antibodies to a particular pathogen. So in this case, because the subclinical stage may or may not have an immune response, it may or may not be positive for the individual animal, but if you employ it as a herd test, then you will be able to figure out whether or not you have the disease in the herd. Because then you'll have, some animals will have an immune response if you have it in the herd, and then you'd still have to go in individually and say, okay, this animal sheds, this animal does not.
Okay, I see.
So, but you can already see it's a very significant workup. I will say that the PCR test also allows you to test environments. So if you don't want to test individual animals, but you have reason to believe that Johne's is in your herd, then instead of doing the blood test, you can do a PCR test with environmental samples. So for example, alleyways, around water troughs, high traffic areas. So you just grab a little bit of fecal material from different spots and send that in, and then we can at least tell you whether or not you have Johne's disease on the premises.
Okay. So if you're like me, you're probably thinking, okay, I'm getting the feel of how serious this is if you were to get Johne's disease in your herd, so how do I not? What are some control mechanisms, some management that we need to be looking at? We're going to talk about that coming up after the break. But this segment today brought to you by Zoetis. Back your instincts and feel more confident in your replacement selection this fall with Adherent Select from Zoetis. Visit beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started.
Build a better herd with genomic EPDs for your commercial females. A cattleman is only as good as his tools. So add Inherit Select from Zoetis to your shoot side lineup to back your intuition and to help reveal the replacements with the potential to be the most productive and profitable in your herd. Keep the best. Sell the rest. Zoetis makes it easy. Order free supplies today so you can easily collect tissue samples when you work cattle this fall. Visit beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. As we continue on, my guest today is Dr. Susan Hinckley with Neogen. We're talking about the Johne's disease and laying that out there. And it is a disease we need to be aware of. As we talked about earlier, it was discovered back in the early 1900s, and the prevalence of it in the United States is starting to see some of it coming back a little bit more. And so we bring this topic to you just for folks as we start to see cattle movement across the country. In addition to maybe there's folks out there buying cattle, whether you're buying replacement cattle or bulls, and just to be aware of this. Dr. Hinckley, in the last segment, we were talking about some of the tests. Let's clarify a little bit here because you talked about two different types of tests. One was a PCR test and one was an ELISA test, and there is a difference of how they are to be used. And you mentioned that a little bit, but let's just make sure we hit that right because one is more of a herd-based test and one is a per-animal test. So we need to be clear on just which one's which.
Yes, absolutely. So the ELISA test is going to be the herd-based test. I had said before that when you have animals in the subclinical stage, they may or may not have an immune response. So this ELISA looks actually for the immune response or the antibodies and not directly for the bacteria. So you're relying on your animals having the antibody response that can then be detectable by that ELISA. But if this particular animal has not developed any antibodies, then you might have what's called a false negative ELISA test. So that's why you should not use the ELISA test on a single animal to determine whether or not it has Johne's disease. That's what the PCR is for. The PCR will actually check the presence of the bacteria or the bacterial DNA in a given animal. And then when you get the result negative, then what you know is that at this time, that animal is not shedding any bacteria.
Okay. So real quick on some of these tests, where do we get them?
Well, any veterinary diagnostic lab, including our lab, by the way. So we offer Johne's disease testing. And as I said, there is this ELISA test and the PCR test. You have to request which one you would want, and then you also have to send in the correct sample type. The most commonly used tests currently are the PCR, and then the herd test is the ELISA.
Okay, so let's walk through this, and somebody says, okay, let's get a test of the herd, and we're going to do the ELISA test on this, and we're going to get the fecal matter, the stuff around the bunks, water tanks, those high traffic areas that you were talking about, and we get a positive result in there. What's the next step?
Mm-hmm. So the next step is you have to make a decision how committed you are to actually get it gone. Because if you wanted to get it gone, the approach that must be taken is test and call.
Okay.
So you will switch to testing all your older animals individually, and you can pool. So the PCR test is sensitive enough that you can submit 5 samples, and they will be pooled into one reaction.
Okay.
And then if that reaction is negative, then that tells you that all 5 animals do not shed at this time. If you find through this test that you have, let's say, 1 or 2 animals that are high shedders, those animals simply need to be gone. Unless you had a pen, so let's say you have a completely isolated pen, and you are committed to leaving those animals in that pen, feed them separately, and accept the fact that that pen will be contaminated with Johne's disease bacteria for a very long time. You also have to make sure that no young stock gets turned out in that pen, right? Let's say your 2 animals that you identified are sick. You take them out of that pen, and then you put some young stock in there, and boom, there you just infected your young stock.
Yeah.
So the control consists of, to be unfortunately very clear. So test and cull means if you have identified positive animals, you have to make a decision whether or not you want to isolate them, feed them out, and then get rid of them. You want to determine whether they're pregnant and you want to raise the calf. If you want the calf in a beef production setting, you have to separate that calf from the mother and bottle feed it, or have a nurse, have it nurse somewhere else. Because if you have a sick cow, very, very likely, without you even testing, that cow will shed the bacteria in the milk and will infect that calf. So if you want to have that calf free from Johne's disease infection, you have to separate it. What you can do for pasture management, if you have enough ground to do so, you need to rotate pastures. So where your contaminated animals have been, that pasture needs to lay for a year for all the bacteria to die off.
Okay.
Mycobacterium paratuberculosis can live in the environment for up to 8 months, depending on the weather conditions. If it's cold and wet, it can live up to 8 months. If it's super hot and dry and dusty, it doesn't live nearly as long, but there's still a certain ability to survive even in the dust. So for pasture management, leaving a pasture without any grazing for at least for a while, and then put young stock on it, that is the way to go. As far as testing goes, it does not make any sense to test all your young stock. Anything up to 1 year of age is useless in testing, because at least for the tests that we have available. Now, an animal 1 year of age will not shed any, so you may just as well save your money.
Okay.
But you might consider them potentially infected and might isolate them on a certain area in a pasture, in a pen, and then move them away from that pen and then put lime on the pen floor and try to kill the bacteria.
Yeah. That was a question I was going to ask too, is just more of the situation of if you're like corrals and more of your confinement facilities that you would have as ranchers. We're not like dairies where we've got everything confined up. So we do have the ability that they're not in those corrals year round. And so that was my question, is how do we clean that up? And lime was...
Lime, lime helps, yes, very much so. Scraping, getting the fecal matter off the surface, scraping, and then lime, that definitely helps.
And a drought, sounds like.
And a drought, yeah. That's about the only good aspect of a drought. But you can see that all that management depends on accurate diagnosis, who is and who is not shedding. You undo all your efforts if you don't spend the effort up front and identify carefully who are your shedders. And if you have what's called a super shedder, the 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 8 number of bacteria per gram of fecal matter, that animal is such a contaminator of pasture or corral, confinement areas alike. You really have to make a decision what you're going to do with an animal like that. Yeah.
All right, let's take another break here. We've got one more segment with Dr. Hinckley as we are talking about Johne's disease. We're going to wrap up our conversation here today. Again, I want to recap a little bit about the prevalence of it, because I think for a lot of us, it's not something that we've really have heard or dealt much with, as it's been something for us in the ranching industry. Just assume that that's mainly something that's seen in the dairy industry, but there is more of it showing up in the beef side of things. I want to just wrap the conversation up with that when we come back here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Capitalize on crossbreeding with Geld-V and Balancer bulls. Raise replacement females with added fertility, increased longevity, and greater productivity. Geld-V and Balancer influenced females wean more pounds of calf per cow exposed. In the feed yard, balancer-influenced cattle offer increased performance, improved feed efficiency, and have excellent carcass merit. Balancers add the pounds, make the grade, and deliver the value. Make your crossbreeding count with Geld V and Balancer Genetics.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest, Dr. Susan Hinckley with Neogen, and we're talking about Johne's disease. And Dr. Hinckley, as we wrap up our conversation about this, we really laid out, what it is, the consequences of it. I want to maybe touch a bit on that here in this segment to reinforce the fact that we do need to be aware of it and what it can do. As I have said, as you and I were talking at the break here, and something that kind of I wrote down here in my notes is, and I've had shows on this where I feel like longevity is one of the biggest profit takers out of our cattle industry, or of our beef cattle industry. If we can't keep cows to a certain age, they're barely paying for themselves and all what you put into them before you're shipping them down the road. Johne's disease is one of those that can cause infertility because the cow's not in good condition. And so we see some premature culling of that cow just naturally because she'll come in open, so we send her down the road. But at the same time, it's a profit taker from our herd.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Johne's disease is one of those where, it's called a silent thief of productivity for a reason. When it first comes in, it's usually when you buy replacement animals or you rent a bull or, anything like that where you bring in other animals without appropriate biosecurity measures. And that animal happens to have Johne's disease. Mm-hmm. If you subject those animals to a high stress situation, that can cause the disease to progress and shedding to increase, or the disease to actually break out and manifest itself as diarrhea. And then from there goes the contamination of your environment and all of that. And a lot of it might go unnoticed by you. So the awareness of the beef producer absolutely has to be, if you have reason to believe that you may have bought Johne's disease, you should definitely not ignore that thought, but try to consult with, a veterinary diagnostic lab. And I do that type of consulting as well. What to do? What is the best way forward for either confirmation you have it on the place, a whole herd ELISA testing, environmental PCR testing, but you should definitely not ignore this idea that you might have bought Johne's disease and do some testing at least to be able to make good management decisions following. Mm-hmm. And I think probably anybody listening to the show now has hopefully fully realized it requires very much a dedication from the owner to try to eradicate Johne's disease. It is possible, but it takes probably, I want to say, 3 years at least of very stringent testing, a lot of investment up front in the testing, but then determine the shedding level and cull.
Mm-hmm. There's a saying that says a prevention is worth a pound, or 1 ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And yes, in this case, this is kind of one of those situations, really, from that standpoint. So what about the purebred outfits that are selling replacement cattle? And I shouldn't just limit that to purebred, because there's a lot of commercial cattle, replacement cattle being sold as well. But when I went purebred, I also meant bull sale folks and then on down to commercial folks that are selling probably replacement females. Do you recommend for them, is there any value to them having some testing done to give some proof to the buyer?
So these animals, if you want to be as sure as you can be, then those need to be PCR tested. Mm-hmm. Individually. A single PCR test is like $25 or $30. So I think that's pretty good. No, unless you buy hundreds of animals. Yeah. But to have an individual animal confirmed that it's not shedding at this time is the best insurance you can get. But as a buyer, it would be wise, I want to say. Like, let's say you rent a bull for a season, I would have him tested. But to be on a fairly safe side, probably as safe as you can be, if you buy animals, have a conversation with the seller and see how much they are aware of Johne's disease.
Yeah. Is there any hotbed areas around the United States that you guys are aware of?
Yeah, hotbed as in where we have a lot of cases in a single area, no, I'm not aware of any.
Mm-hmm. But again, probably in some ways, the answer to our question or my question earlier on, as far as environment, it's probably, as you said, it's going to be a little bit more prevalent where there's moisture and conditions. I mean, to say that you're going to see it in some of these really dry desert states, I mean, not that it can't happen, but the prevalence is probably going to be a little less, I'm guessing.
That would be my guess as well. I have not actually sat down and done a meaningful survey of those cases and where they came from. But from the standpoint of viability of Johne's bacteria in the environment, yes, that would be correct.
Yeah. And just one final thing to re-quote or restate again, you talked about the prevalence in the beef herd. What was that number again that you had talked about that I think will bring this back into some seriousness of why we have this subject here today?
Yeah, so that number is 8%. 8% of the beef herds in the U.S. contain at least one infected animal. So that does not mean diseased. That says infected. So the bacteria have been detected.
All right. Well, Dr. Hinckley, thanks for the information on this. It's definitely just something I think if we're a rancher and we're in the beef industry, we need to be aware of this. So as you said, when we see something happening, maybe this, what we've talked about here today, jog somebody's memory about, oh, well, maybe we should go look at this element. So I think that'll help. And appreciate you joining us here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Yep. You're very welcome. I appreciate being here.
You bet. And again, Dr. Susan Hinckley, Director of Veterinary Diagnostics with Neogen, joining us here today as we go in depth looking at Johne's disease. Definitely something that's maybe folks are aware of, not to the level that we talked about here today, I'm certain. However, it is good to be aware of that just so that you know. So should something kind of come up in your herd that seems just a little bit fishy, for example, as she had said, doesn't have a fever, doesn't have other symptoms, but yet still not gaining and losing body condition, might be something you want to consider in looking at that and getting that tested. Now, one of the things I would encourage you to do is, should you have questions about it, get a hold of your veterinarian, talk to them, or I will also put a link on Dr. Hinckley's name in the podcast description. If you click on that link, it'll take you directly to her email, and you can sure ask her any questions if you have those as well. We'll stay with us. Coming up after the break, the Captain Tim O'Byrne will be in for this week's edition of Tim's 2 Cents, and we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. This segment today brought to you by Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring, all from the convenience of your phone, powered by solar, satellite, and cell. Keep an eye on your water supply. It's what we do to watch our cistern storage tanks with daily text messages. You can call Meadowlark Solutions today for tank monitors, well controllers, generators, and more. 801-252-6135, or check them out online at tanktoad.com.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. Justin, I want to know what you think about this, and also you folks that are up there in the cattle associations that are handling our affairs and international trade and the packer and stockyard stuff and all that. BRIC. It's an association of countries that are made up primarily of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and now since its inception in 2009 as a Goldman Sachs asset management suggestion that these countries get together and create their own, I don't know what you call it, kind of a monetary society, economic platform. They're holding a summit this week, and I don't know, it's just some of the things that they've got cooking. They want to move away from the U.S. dollar and create their own system and that sort of thing. It kind of bothers me that here we have a whole association of countries that are, not high up there on the respectability list. And yet here in this country, we're still doing business with JBS USA. And I'm just wondering, if they want to do that, if Brazil wants to be part of that group, that's their prerogative. But I'm not necessarily comfortable with doing business on a major scale with a Brazilian-owned company that is got a huge footprint here in the United States. And I don't know how far our lawmakers are going to go to protect us from stuff like that. So what are your thoughts on that, Justin? And you folks out there that are dealing with this stuff, let me know. You can find me online. Back to you in the studio, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain, and some very valid concerns there. When we look at a major meatpacking company, the largest meatpacking company here in the United States, it's a double-edged sword. There's an investment that they made that we definitely need in the industry, but at the same time, when it's to that size and scope, there's the ability to control that, and not only in the United States, but globally as well. And I think that's the concern there when it's foreign owned. And of course, in the country of Brazil, where the two brothers that own JBS are from, then we start looking at the collaboration of these countries, like the captain said, the BRICS countries, which are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And there's a couple countries in there that we continue to have international conflicts with, those being Russia and China. And in the past 15 plus years since BRICS was established, China has become heavily invested in the country of Brazil. So the real question is, when the cards have to be played, just where is that allegiance going to lie? But like the captain said too, let's continue to work on our congressmen and women and keep this issue on the forefront of their plate as well, and do that through our industry organizations, as well as when those congressmen and women come to your hometown and have a town hall meeting, bring this issue up to them as well. Well, let's turn now and take a look at our weather. Joining us now is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, it looks like as we look at where this weather is going to be the first part of this coming week, at least half of the country, trick-or-treaters, are going to be in good weather, the eastern side, whereas those of us in the western side, it's going to get a little nippy.
Yeah, it will. We're finally seeing the weather patterns change to where it might just seem a little bit more like it should. I mean, so much of the U.S. has had a very warm, dry stretch of weather. I mean, it's covered a lot of real estate, the West, the Central, the Great Lakes. Only the southeast part of the United States that was affected by the two hurricanes has really had any significant precipitation. But now we're starting to see some adjustments where the Pacific is starting to get more stormy. If the Pacific gets more stormy, well, eventually that has to come into Western North America, then eventually Central USA, and that's what we're going to see. Mm-hmm. So as we go into the Halloween week, especially by the middle of the week, we're going to see the whole Western United States get a lot colder. There's going to be some rain and snow, and eventually that cold air, it'll be slow, but it will work its way east into the plains, then into the Northwest Corn Belt, bringing a spell of much colder weather.
Kind of like instead of molasses in January, it's going to be molasses in November. It's just be slow rolling in, huh?
Yeah, slow rolling in, but definitely the Rockies west to the West Coast is going to feel the effects the first. That's where the big deviation in temperatures will be, and that's where the best chance of precipitation will be. But if you kind of think of this pattern we've been in for the last couple of months, it's been so persistent. We had that storm come around the 17th and 18th of October that did finally bring a change of weather. That was sort of the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, to try to beat down the high pressure that's been dominant. So it weakened it. So it kind of came back a little bit, but these next two systems will beat it down a little bit more, and eventually it won't be able to hold on any longer. And that's why it's going to be a slow process to spread the cold west to east.
Okay, so as you had said, we're definitely going to see it in the northern western part of the country. What about as it moves into, and we get into later into November or early part of November, what do we see, say, east side of the Missouri or Mississippi River?
Well, I think it's going to be towards the middle of the month where they're going to start to see it. We still have, there's some hints of maybe a tropical system we'll need to keep an eye on the week after this one. Election week, we'll need to keep an eye on that. That may have an impact, but it probably is the middle of November, the second, third week, where those colder temperatures and more in the way of a late fall, early winter pattern will affect those eastern areas.
Okay, so when you talk about this moving in, and of course it's coming out of the Pacific Northwest, and we definitely see where it's going to see the northern tier of the country, how far south is some of this cold going to get For example, I know the Great Basin's going to get a little bit of this, but what about further south and south central?
Well, first of all, let's go a little bit west. We'll go into the desert Southwest. I do think there'll be some rain and snow getting into places as far south as Arizona, the Four Corners region. That area did quite well with that first system a week or so ago. We're also going to see cold air get down into the southern plains. We could see it get down into western Kansas, maybe the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles by next weekend. I think some of that cold will spill down into the air. Maybe even a few flakes of snow in the panhandles can't be ruled out.
Yeah.
So, and those southern plains areas, there's one area that didn't get a lot of news that should have, was the eastern New Mexico. We saw a big flash flood in the Roswell, New Mexico area. They got nearly 6 inches of rain in 2 hours. A really, really bad flash flood situation, but there was significant rain. I mean, 3, 4, 5 inches in a wide swath of far eastern New Mexico that got into far western areas of Texas with that first system. And when you see a system like that in the fall, historically, that's kind of a precursor that will come later on into those areas. So I do think that's an area to watch as we get into the middle of the month.
Okay. All right. Well, it kind of gives us an idea of what we have coming down the pike here. Appreciate the update with a look at our long-term weather.
Sounds good.
And you can stay aware of what's going on with our weather forecast across the country by tuning in each and every morning to Don's daily video podcast. You can find that link to his YouTube channel at dayweather.com.
It's decision time. Which heifers are you keeping? Which are you selling? Make sort gate decisions easier with genomic EPDs for your commercial females. Back your instincts with Inherit Select from Zoetis. Feel more confident knowing you're selecting heifers with the potential to be the most productive and profitable in your herd. Keep the best. Sell the rest. Zoetis makes it easy. Order free supplies today so you can easily collect tissue samples when you work cattle this fall. Visit beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started.
Are you tired of putting the wear and tear on your ranch pickup or your good side-by-side out checking stock tanks or reservoirs? Or maybe it's just keeping an eye on a remote ranch location. When you stop and you think about it and you start to calculate the cost of your time, fuel, and miles on your vehicles, you're going to scare yourself. But there really is a very simple and a reassuring solution, and it's called Barn Owl. Barn Owl off-grid cameras and smart alerts provide you that assurance, and there's no question it is a time and a money saver. From anywhere at any time, no Wi-Fi or power needed. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl. Be sure to be checking in your mailbox for the next issue of Working Ranch Magazine. The captain, Tim O'Byrne, telling me that it has been sent out. I haven't yet gotten mine, but I'm sure I will be here in the next week or so. By the way, if you are not a subscriber to Working Ranch Magazine, you can do it by going to the website at workingranchmag.com. A quick thank you to our sponsors today, Inherit Select from Zoetis, the American Gelbvieh Association, your off-grid camera systems by Barn Owl. Find out more at barnowl.tech. Cowpuncher Coffee, it's what we drink here on the X-Ring Ranch. Tank Toad, your remote water monitoring system. And Smart Lick Supplements. Find out more at smartlick.com. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. To get a hold of me, my email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Thanks for joining us. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.